In the city of Berlin, on Museum Island, in the middle of the river Spree, there is an incredible manuscript found in the Ägyptisches Museum and Papyrussammlung, the Egyptian Museum and Papyrus Collection. This manuscript is a papyrus found in the 19th century and then brought to Europe. Here it was purchased by a Berlin collector, and thereafter ended up in the museum amongst many other ancient Egyptian papyri. It has the rather unexciting title of Berlin Papyrus 6619. Have no doubt, though, this is an extremely important document. In it are contained details of both ancient Egyptian medicine and several mathematical theorems. Although much of the manuscript is legible, the papyrus is damaged and the text, produced in hieratic hieroglyphics, cannot be made out 100%. Still, from what Egyptologists and historians have been able to decipher, it is clear that the equations are of immense importance. One of them basically lays out the fundamental principle of the Pythagorean theorem on how to measure a triangle based on the length of the sides and the hypotenuse. The only issue is that the Berlin papyrus was produced in Middle Kingdom Egypt around 1300 or 1400 years before Pythagoras' time. This is an extraordinary find, demonstrating how ahead of their time the Egyptians of the Middle Kingdom were. And yet, the Middle Kingdom is neglected today, completely overshadowed by the two other golden ages of ancient Egyptian society. These are the Old Kingdom of the 3rd millennium BC, when the Great Pyramid at Giza and the Sphinx were built, and the New Kingdom that followed soon after the Middle Kingdom. This was when the Egyptian Empire extended into Libya, Sudan and the Levant, and famous rulers like Ramesses II and Tutankhamun presided over Egypt. Perhaps the comparative neglect of the Middle Kingdom is warranted, but as the Berlin Papyrus suggests, this was a culture that had its own accomplishments, especially so in the fields of scholarship and science, rather than through pyramid building, wars and the erection of impressive temples. This is the story of the Middle Kingdom of ancient Egypt, the frequently overlooked golden age of ancient Egypt. The Middle Kingdom is generally dated to between 2040 BC and 1782 BC, or thereabouts. The dating is not precise, as there are different king or pharaoh lists that have survived for ancient Egypt. There are also slight variations in their details, which means dates of dynasties and reigns can vary by a few years or even a decade or two here and there. Still, the Middle Kingdom is generally dated from the middle of the 21st century BC to the early 18th century BC, a period of just over 250 years, or a quarter of a millennium. By then, Egypt had gone through a millennium of complex history already. It forms part of the Fertile Crescent, a crescent-shaped expanse of land stretching from Egypt north into the Levant and then curving through the Syrian desert, extending into what is now southeastern Turkey, before descending to the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Iraq. This stretch of the Middle East was coated in a rich layer of alluvial soils when the last ice age ended around 12,000 years ago. This was when the first major Neolithic societies began to develop in the region over a period of thousands of years. Archaeologists continue to unravel the complexities of how these late Stone Age societies developed. What is clear is that by the 4th millennium BC, significant towns were developing, facilitated by the growth of agriculture. In this period, agriculture had reached an advanced enough stage that some people could gather in spaces where people undertook occupations entirely separate from food production. Egypt, fed by the River Nile, was one of the first great centers of this type of development. As such, It also developed one of the world's first pictographic writing systems, hieroglyphics, which emerged here in the late 4th millennium BC. Around the same time, there were efforts in the area to unite all the lands along the lower course of the River Nile, a feat achieved by a ruler named Namer, around the same time that hieroglyphics were first developed. About 3 to 4 centuries later, the Old Kingdom emerged in Egypt, the rulers of which built the Great Pyramid and Sphinx on the Giza Plateau, and many other noteworthy funerary monuments around northern Egypt. The Old Kingdom lasted as the first golden age of ancient Egyptian culture down to 2200 BC or a little after it. It was a period of considerable stability. Consider that in its 500-year period, there were just 4 families that ruled Egypt: the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th dynasties. By way of contrast, in a period of only around 140 years, roughly from about 2180 BC to 2040 BC, Egypt went through 4 or 5 dynasties, depending on how it is interpreted. Moreover, the crowns of Lower and Upper Egypt, the names used to describe the northern low-lying part of the country and the Nile Delta, and the more elevated southern part of the country, where the Nile flows in a straighter line, were often not unified. Instead, there were civil wars and instability prevailed. As a result, when Egyptologists began seriously studying the history of ancient Egypt in the 19th century, once they had deciphered hieroglyphics and could start reading the available source material, this period was categorized as the First Intermediate Period. Monumental building of the kind that had led to the construction of the pyramids during the Old Kingdom era now largely stopped. This was in large part due to the collapse of strong government, meaning that large projects of this kind, requiring huge resources, could not be put together by the governments of the time. It was only with the gradual reunification of the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt by the kings of the 11th dynasty that order and unity was restored, and Egypt entered into a new golden age. The concept of a Middle Kingdom in the history of ancient Egypt was devised by the German scholar and diplomat Baron Christian von Bunsen. In the 1840s, he published an extensive multi-volume study of ancient Egypt. This was fueled by the wave of enthusiasm for Egyptology that had gripped Europe in the decades following the deciphering of hieroglyphics using the Rosetta Stone, a trilingual treaty stone which had been found in Egypt during the French expedition there at the end of the French Revolutionary Wars. It was von Bunsen who first theorized that there were 3 golden ages in the extremely long history of ancient Egypt. The Old Kingdom of the period roughly from 2700 BC to 2200 BC. The Middle Kingdom of the period from around 2040 BC to 1782 BC, and a New Kingdom that characterized the High and Late Bronze Age between roughly 1550 BC and 1190 BC. Each of these periods was punctuated by intermediate periods of civil war and instability, whereas the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms were eras of strong centralized government, impressive cultural achievement, and civilizational progression. Yet despite von Bunsen's categorization and the way it has been followed by Egyptologists ever since, the Middle Kingdom has always been treated as the inferior Golden Age. The Old Kingdom, for example, will always be known for the Great Pyramid of Giza and the Sphinx. Similarly, the New Kingdom is synonymous with famous pharaohs like Thutmose III, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and Ramesses II, as well as the monumental temples they built at Thebes. The Middle Kingdom, however, is much more obscure to the wider public. The 11th dynasty actually began around 2150 BC and was present over much of the first intermediate period. What was different from the Old Kingdom was that the dynasty didn't rule over all of Upper and Lower Egypt as a homogeneous state. Instead, its power overlapped with that of the 9th and 10th dynasties that controlled other parts of Egypt. The 11th dynasty ruled from the city of Thebes in Upper Egypt, which is synonymous with the modern-day city of Luxor in central Egypt, along the banks of the River Nile. It is known for being the site of many well-preserved temples today, while the Valley of the Kings and Queens are in the foothills across the river on the western side of the Nile. Conversely, the 10th dynasty controlled much of Lower Egypt from their own capital, Henennesut, or Henensu, which means Child of the King, or House of the Child King. It is more widely known today by its ancient Roman name, Heracleopolis Magna, which means Great City of Heracles. This is located much further to the north of Thebes, near the Old Kingdom capital at Memphis, which is itself not far south of modern-day Cairo. The 9th dynasty only ruled for a few decades here, before being replaced by the much more enduring 10th dynasty. Hence, the situation which prevailed prior to the inception of the Middle Kingdom was that the 11th dynasty ruled most of Upper Egypt, or the southern and central parts of the country from Thebes, while the 10th dynasty ruled Lower Egypt, including the region around Cairo and the Nile Delta, from their own capital at Henennesut. The Middle Kingdom would only gradually come into existence as the 11th dynasty reunified the two parts of ancient Egypt under their sole rule. This was to create a new strong kingship of the kind seen under the Old Kingdom. One ruler, above all, was responsible for the ascent of the 11th dynasty to rule all of Egypt. His name was King Mentuhotep II, and he is generally understood to have had a long-lasting reign, as much as half a century, roughly from around 2060 BC to around 2010 BC. This is a good place to reflect on the nature of the sources for the Middle Kingdom, or indeed the chronology and rulers of all of ancient Egypt. The main sources for establishing who ruled Egypt over a period of nearly 3,000 years in ancient times, and how long they reigned for, are a number of so-called king lists. The most extensive and detailed is the Turin king list, which is understood to have been produced in the 13th century BC during the reign of Ramesses II. The Turin king list sits in the Egyptian Museum in Turin in Italy today. It contains names of kings of Egypt going back to the Old Kingdom and the length of their reigns. Similar lists include the Abydos king list, which was found as a tablet on a temple wall at Abydos in Egypt and which lists nearly 80 kings. Another is the Saqqara tablet, or Saqqara king list, found, fairly unsurprisingly, at Saqqara in Egypt in the middle of the 19th century. The lists also include the works of Manetho, an Egyptian priest who wrote much later in the 3rd century BC, when the Greek city of Alexandria in the Nile Delta had become the world's center of scholarship. Each of these lists can provide fragmentary evidence which allows us to build up a contextual picture of the period. However, there are several conflicts between each of the lists. This is for various reasons. Manetho, for instance, wrote in Greek, despite being Egyptian. His works have also not survived in full and are found as early medieval fragmentary copies. This means that he provided Greek names. Equally, the duration of reigns provided on the king lists can vary, as the Egyptians had 3 different ways of recording time. They used both a solar and a lunar calendar. Reigns were also calculated according to the number of cattle counts which occurred during a specific king's time. These were government methods of deciding on taxation by counting the number of livestock owned by farmers and nobles. More than one cattle count could occur in a year, and, if it did, the king in question could be recorded as serving for more years than he did in reality. These problems are exemplified in the issues surrounding Mentuhotep II's reign. The Turin king list and Manetho variously suggested that he ruled for around 46 to 51 years. Different lists used different names for him. Manetho variously referred to him as Menthesouphis or Amenemnes, depending on which medieval copy of his work is being consulted. Alternatively, he could be referred to by his throne name in the king's lists, which was Nebhepetre. Ancient Egyptian kings had a personal name or a throne name, and sometimes a separate Horus name, titles which they adopted as their royal titles upon becoming ruler. What this means for Mentuhotep II is that we have various names for him. It is generally agreed that he ruled for a long time, upwards of half a century. However, there is considerable debate as to whether this was primarily at the end of the 3rd millennium BC, roughly between 2060 BC and 2010 BC, or if his reign started later and stretched into the 2nd millennium BC. What is broadly clear is that he was a successful ruler who managed to unite Egypt under the rule of the 11th dynasty, vanquishing the 10th dynasty in the process. Mentuhotep II accomplished this by around the 39th year of his reign, at which time he began using the cognomen Itjtawy, which means he who unifies the two lands. Thereafter, he carried out reforms to centralize power in the hands of the king and the royal government. This was to strip away the power of the nomarchs, or regional governors, whose increased independence had caused the instability of the first intermediate period. What this means is that the Middle Kingdom did not neatly begin at the start of a specific dynasty, as was the case with the Old Kingdom, which is typically identified as starting with the reign of the first ruler of the 3rd dynasty, Djoser. Instead, the Middle Kingdom sort of began in the middle of the 11th dynasty, when Mentuhotep II united Egypt under his rule. It is typically understood to have consisted of either 7, 8, or 9 kings. They were not known as pharaohs during this era. That is a later terminology that was developed during the New Kingdom, although, admittedly, it is regularly applied retroactively to the rulers of the Old and Middle Kingdoms. Mentuhotep II dominated the dynasty through the sheer length of his reign and the impact of it. There were 2 more kings of the dynasty after him, Mentuhotep III and Mentuhotep IV, who ruled for about 10 and 7 years respectively. Then the 11th dynasty died out and was replaced by the 12th dynasty, perhaps because Mentuhotep IV had no children, or possibly owing to more malicious events, which we'll return to presently. The point is that the Middle Kingdom was firmly established in the later decades of the 11th dynasty. A feature of this transition was the issue of where the capital of the Middle Kingdom would be located. During the Old Kingdom, this had been at Memphis. The 11th dynasty ruled from Thebes prior to Mentuhotep II's unification of the kingdom. He therefore continued to rule from there, but afterwards consideration was given to returning it to Memphis, while for a time, at the start of the 12th dynasty, a new capital again was briefly established. This new capital was in the town of El-Lisht, which sits strategically on the entryway to the Faiyum oasis, a large oasis southwest of Cairo. Eventually, though, the capital was returned to Thebes. It would broadly remain the capital of Egypt throughout the Middle Kingdom and into the subsequent New Kingdom. The first ruler of the 12th dynasty was Amenemhat I. He assumed the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt around 1991 BC. He had been a powerful figure during the last years of the 11th dynasty, serving as vizier, the de facto head of the government. Egyptologists still disagree as to whether or not he was a consensus candidate to assume the kingship after the death of Mentuhotep IV, without children and a clear heir. It could have been that Amenemhat I seized control of the kingdom violently, displacing Mentuhotep and establishing a new ruling dynasty. Egyptologists are generally agreed that there were 7 further rulers of the 12th dynasty, making it a fairly cohesive dynasty. These were, in order of succession, Senusret I, Amenemhat II, Senusret II, Senusret III, Amenemhat III, Amenemhat IV, and Sobekneferu. Nearly all of them ruled for extended periods of time, between 30 and 45 years or so, except for the final 2, Amenemhat IV and Sobekneferu. Sobekneferu is unusual in being the first confirmed queen of ancient Egypt. There are queens that appear on the king lists for earlier periods. However, it is disputed whether they actually ruled in their own right or were listed as consorts of their husbands or regents for sons who had ascended as king while they were children. Sobekneferu, by way of contrast, is accepted by nearly all Egyptologists as a full queen in her own right. These 8 rulers of the 12th dynasty presided over the Middle Kingdom at its peak, between around 1990 BC and 1800 BC, nearly 2 centuries in which strong rule prevailed. It was during this period that the kingdom was stable and united, and trade and culture flourished. A clear indication of the strength of the 12th dynasty is seen in the manner in which they began trying to emulate their old kingdom forebears from 600 or 700 years earlier. It is believed that each of these 8 rulers ordered the construction of a pyramid as a mortuary tomb for their remains in the afterlife. This was a program of pyramid building not seen in such an ambitious way since the 3rd, 4th, and 5th dynasties of the Old Kingdom. Admittedly, these tombs are less well known today, for the simple reason that most of the 12th dynasty variants have collapsed, while the identity of the rulers for whom 2 pyramids at Masguna were erected remains a point of debate. They were undertaken on a similar scale to the pyramids at Giza, Saqqara, and Dashur during the Old Kingdom. For instance, the first ruler of the 12th dynasty, Amenemhat I, ordered the construction of a pyramid at Lisht, the temporary capital at the time, near the Faiyum oasis. In its prime, it rose nearly 200 feet high and would have appeared as impressive as some of the Old Kingdom pyramids, but the construction methods used were far less satisfactory than those employed by the architects and engineers of the 4th dynasty in particular. Their Middle Kingdom successors knew how to build a pyramid and how to encase it in nice polished stone, but the core was generally filled with loose material and even sand in places, meaning that it had no durability over time. This cheap construction method means that the pyramid of Amenemhat I is simply a 70 to 80 foot high mass of sand and rubble today. A number of alternative experimental methods were used by the other rulers of the 12th dynasty. They certainly didn't lack ambition. Senusret II attempted to build a pyramid at Dashur, one of the main Old Kingdom necropolis sites. This was nearly as big as the 2 great pyramids at Giza. Again, though, the methods ensured Senusret's pyramid has not survived intact, albeit, in this instance, there are very substantial remains. From amongst these pyramids, that of Amenemhat III merits special mention for a number of reasons. It was built at Dashur and is quite well preserved, while also having a number of very unique design features. The pyramid was a combination between an old-style pyramid and a mortuary temple. Like the other Middle Kingdom pyramids, it was built with bricks and clay rather than large stones, although it is better preserved than most of its Middle Kingdom contemporaries. It was built with 2 entrances that led through a large series of walls and towards 10 different shaft tombs. Natural rock was incorporated into the core of the pyramid. The whole structure would have been initially encased in limestone to give it a polished and refined look 4,000 years ago. However, the limestone has long since been removed and much of the brick structure has collapsed. Nevertheless, there is enough of a pyramid-shaped set of remains with a blackish hue that the ruins have earned the name the Black Pyramid of Amenemhat III. There were also a series of complex subterranean tunnels underneath the pyramid, while the entire structure was capped by a solid black granite pyramidion. These were the capstones that were placed at the very peak of most of the ancient pyramids. In the case of the Black Pyramid, though, the capstone has survived and is in remarkably good condition almost 4,000 years later. Hieroglyphics on the 4 sides give praise to many of the foremost deities of ancient Egypt like Ra, Osiris, and Anubis. The granite might once have also been coated with some electrum, a precious, naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver, but this has long since been stripped off the pyramidion. Regardless, it remains arguably the best preserved pyramidion from all of ancient Egypt. The Middle Kingdom did not occur in isolation. The earlier Old Kingdom was comparatively isolated. There were thriving city-states in Mesopotamia in modern-day Iraq at the time, but there were few other great centers of power around the eastern Mediterranean. By way of contrast, the era of the Middle Kingdom was a period in which a dynamic, interconnected world was beginning to emerge in the eastern Mediterranean and Mesopotamia. It was also an era of new technological and intellectual development, later named the Early Bronze Age. In part, the desire to produce bronze, the new and more effective amalgam metal of copper and tin, drove the regional expansion. This is because kingdoms needed to trade with each other to acquire the copper and tin needed to create bronze. Trade was particularly focused on Cyprus, one of the ancient world's great sources of copper. While there were powerful cities and towns emerging all across the eastern Mediterranean and West Asia, some stood out. In Mesopotamia, for example, the Sumerian Renaissance gave way to the early Babylonian Empire from around 1900 BC. As we will see, this was the most advanced state at this time in the known world other than Egypt. On Crete, the Old Palace period of the Minoan civilization was emerging. Soon it would produce one of the greatest cultures of the Mediterranean during the Bronze Age. In the Levant, cities such as Byblos and Hazor had developed as great trading centers of things like cedarwood and pearls. More groups again, like the Amorites, Hurrians, and Elamites, lay further afield in places like the southern Caucasus and Iran. Each of these kingdoms and states was becoming more powerful and advanced. As trade flourished between them, they fed into each other's development in a way which had not happened in West Asia at the time of the Old Kingdom. We have already seen an example of how the mathematical knowledge of the Egyptians of the Middle Kingdom was way ahead of its time in terms of the knowledge of Pythagoras' theorems shown on the Berlin Papyrus. This is a striking example of the mathematical knowledge of the Middle Kingdom Egyptians. What was even more impressive was their knowledge of the stars and how they applied astronomy to their society. Already, during the first intermediate period, Egyptian priests and scholars were developing star charts that mapped the sky. Central to this was the concept of 36 decans. These were 36 groups of stars that the Egyptians had worked out could be used to map the night sky. Furthermore, they were charted in such a way that these decans tended to move every 10 days, so that certain decans that had become obscured towards dawn because of the positioning of the sun became visible again. They consequently incorporated the decans into how they charted time and the night sky, but also their calendars, which were very sophisticated. They had both a solar and lunar calendar. The solar calendar was more accurate and consisted for them of 12 months of 30 days each, followed by 5 epagomenal or spare days. The Middle Kingdom Egyptians clearly attached great significance to their star charts and other astronomical knowledge. This is evident as we find the star charts or star tables reproduced in elaborate artistic format on the coffin lids of the kings of the 11th and 12th dynasties. They were also moving towards a system of lunar stations of the kind which tracked the lunar progress. This would eventually result in the development of the concept of the 12 signs of the zodiac. Inevitably, their detailed knowledge of mathematics developed in tandem as they tried to calculate the distance between stars, how they moved, and the measures needed to triangulate their positions in the night sky. The Middle Kingdom Egyptians were not alone in developing this kind of knowledge of the stars and mathematics. It was also central to the knowledge systems acquired by the priests of the temples of the old Babylonian Empire at the very same time in the cities of Mesopotamia. The evidence is more difficult to piece together accurately when it comes to the Babylonians, as much of it is derived from clay tablets that were inscribed in the 1st millennium BC. Clearly, many of the sources in question date to the time of the old Babylonian Empire that overlapped substantially with the Middle Kingdom. For instance, the so-called Venus tablets of Amisaduqa, a record of astronomical observations of the planet Venus, must date back to the 18th or 17th centuries BC, as there are observations of where Venus was positioned around that time. There are many surviving fragments of the Venus tablets, suggesting a wide readership. Furthermore, there are connections between the old Babylonians and astronomical studies being undertaken at the time, further to the east, in what is now Iran. All of this suggests a joined-up intellectual world in which Middle Kingdom Egypt possibly influenced Babylon and other parts of the Middle East. Trade networks along which cultural ideas and knowledge passed were expanding at the same time. This is suggestive that the Middle Kingdom was influential in shaping wider societal developments in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East in the first half of the 2nd millennium BC. It is surely not entirely a coincidence that advanced cultures such as those of Mycenae in Greece, the Minoans on Crete, and the cultures of Anatolia, like the Hittite Empire, began to emerge towards the tail end of the Middle Kingdom. A further element of Middle Kingdom scholarship and knowledge evolution which cannot be overlooked is the Egyptians' growing wisdom when it came to medicine at this time. There was medical knowledge included in the Berlin Papyrus, and this extended to other papyrus manuscripts of the Middle Kingdom era that have survived intact, or partially so, down to modern times. Take the example of the Kahun Gynecological Papyrus. This is the oldest known medical text of ancient Egyptian history. It was most likely produced in the second half of the 19th century BC, that is, sometime between 1850 BC and 1800 BC. As the name indicates, it contains information on female reproductive health, especially supposed ways to increase fertility and the chances of conception, as well as how to address various issues during pregnancy and childbirth. Admittedly, most of the medical advice offered here wouldn't pass muster in a modern hospital. There is a lot of recommendation of using oils and incense to fumigate the womb, and 2 alarming passages where the use of crocodile dung and donkey urine are proposed to cure various ailments. However, there are more sensible proposals. A passage on the papyrus recommends the avoidance of alcohol during certain stages of pregnancy, while various emetics and balms are proposed. The text is fragmentary, and some of the medical advice offered can only be partially reconstructed. so it isn't possible to appraise the suitability of the medical advice in all cases. Still, the very fact that the ancient Egyptians were starting to write down medical advice and consider things like the use of oils, many of which do have medical properties, and abstinence from alcohol, is reflective of growing medical knowledge and inquiry during the Middle Kingdom. But the Middle Kingdom Egyptians were possibly responsible for passing on various types of astronomical, medical, and mathematical knowledge to other societies was related to the expansion of the Middle Kingdom. After Mentuhotep II and his successors during the late 11th and early 12th dynasties had cemented a strong centralized kingship once again, the rulers of the 12th dynasty began expanding beyond Egypt. A notable ruler in this regard was Senusret III, who ruled for a lengthy period of time, nearly 40 years, between 1878 BC and 1839 BC. There is some slight evidence of him campaigning into the Levant against the Canaanites, a broad term used to describe the people of the Levant in the 2nd millennium BC. There were already affluent cities here, such as Byblos, that the Egyptians would doubtlessly have liked to get their hands on. However, the evidence is not substantial enough to indicate exactly how much they extended their influence or military power into the region. The opposite is true of the southward expansion of the kingdom into Nubia. Senusret III campaigned himself in person here, extending his realm southwards from the first cataract of the Nile to the second, swallowing up some 250 kilometers of additional territory up the course of the Nile in the process. We know this because of the survival of the Semna boundary stela. In an age before any real advanced cartography, and when the concept of borders or territorial integrity was very loose, rulers had to try to signal to the world, by whatever means they could find, that they controlled a region. In the case of the ancient Egyptians, they set up boundary stelae. These were basically largish stone tablets with hieroglyphics, stating that the king's writ ran as far as the stela. The Semna boundary stela was set up in the 16th year of the reign of Senusret III. This site was well into Nubia and is in Sudan today, approximately 100 kilometers south of the border with Egypt. Not only was a boundary stela set up here, there were also several forts constructed either side of the River Nile during the Middle Kingdom, indicating an aggressive southwards expansion into Nubia. The Middle Kingdom was an era of change for people internally within Egypt. It can be hard to gauge the subtleties of some of this from the vantage point of 4,000 years later, and with limited and fragmentary knowledge. Moreover, the vagaries of day-to-day life remained the same for the common person, focused on agriculture along the banks of the River Nile. Yet subtle variations can be identified. The religious system, for instance, remained broadly the same as it had been for well over 1,000 years. The Egyptians worshipped a pantheon of hundreds of gods and goddesses, and had an elaborate mythological and cosmological system that explained the world, their place in it, and the nature of life and death. What was shifting in the Middle Kingdom period was the importance attached to certain gods. Ra, the sun god, who was said to traverse the sky in his solar arc in the daytime, bringing light to the world, had been the foremost deity in Old Kingdom Egypt. That changed during the Middle Kingdom. There was growing emphasis on Osiris, the ruler of the underworld, and his sister wife Isis. More importantly, the falcon war god Montu briefly emerged as a significant deity, as he was associated with the Middle Kingdom capital Thebes. Ultimately, though, it was another local Theban deity, Amun, that really entered the Egyptian religious consciousness in an abrupt way. He was fused with the worship of Ra to form Amun-Ra, and we find Senusret I building the White Chapel of Amun-Ra in Thebes, establishing this part of the city as a religious site that would later host the great New Kingdom temple of Karnak. At surface level, the ruins of the collapsed pyramids of the Middle Kingdom might be fairly disappointing to behold 4,000 years after they were first built, especially when compared with their Old Kingdom predecessors. However, there were many innovations made in art and architecture during the Middle Kingdom which were highly significant. For instance, it's from this period that we have the first examples of block statues, a form that was still in use nearly 2 millennia later, when the Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Egypt. These show an individual seated and their legs bent upwards. The form had the advantage of being easier to carve out of a single block of stone. Much more significant was the appearance of the first obelisks. Most people today quite understandably believe that the obelisk is a piece of religious and mortuary architecture which only began in the New Kingdom. They did indeed proliferate in the New Kingdom, and the most famous examples come from the reigns of Thutmose III and Ramesses II. However, the first obelisks that we know of were actually erected by Senusret I during his long reign in the middle of the 20th century BC. He erected 2 of these tall and thin monuments, which contained hieroglyphic inscriptions about his reign and his relationship to the gods. Unfortunately, one of these, the Abgig obelisk, is very badly damaged today. It was located at Faiyum and was exposed to the desert winds for millennia, eroding the exterior and eventually causing it to fall over and break in half at some stage in the late 17th or 18th centuries. The older of the pair, and as a result the oldest obelisk anywhere in the world, has survived in a much better state. The Al-Masala obelisk stands at Heliopolis. It is made of red granite and still stands nearly 70 foot high and weighing 120 tons in its original location. The large hieroglyphics carved into it remain very clear to the eye and show Senusret's royal names. Perhaps the most famous of all the Middle Kingdom texts was the Instructions of Amenemhat, sometimes alternately referred to as the Teachings of King Amenemhat to his son Senusret. Although the 12th dynasty was generally a very stable period of royal history, King Amenemhat I was apparently assassinated around 1962 BC at the end of a reign that had lasted nearly 30 years. His son, Senusret I, had already been a co-ruler alongside his aging father at that time. He ended up in a civil war following his father's assassination, which he soon emerged from to become amongst the most notable rulers of Middle Kingdom Egypt, as his obelisks attest. The instructions were seemingly written during Senusret's reign as a testament to his father's reign. They were framed as the deceased Amenemhat appearing to Senusret in a dream, during which he describes his own assassination as follows. It was after supper, when night had fallen, and I had spent an hour of happiness. I was asleep upon my bed, having become weary, and my heart had begun to follow sleep. As I came to, I awoke to fighting, and found that it was an attack of the bodyguard. If I had quickly taken weapons in my hand, I would have made the wretches retreat with a charge. But there is none mighty in the night, none who can fight alone. No success will come without a helper. My injury happened while I was without you. He then goes on to offer his son instructions for how to rule Egypt as his successor, primarily by describing his own reign and the things which he got both right and wrong. The instructions to Amenemhat were clearly a popular text. 1,000 years later, it was still being used as a template for similar instructional poems, and surviving copies indicate that it was being read as late as the Ptolemaic era, a millennium and a half after it was first written. The literature of the era also gives us additional insight into the nature of government in Middle Kingdom Egypt. Clearly this was a period in which the Egyptian kingdom's power was considerable. Many, many centuries later, there was even a tradition that one of the 12th dynasty kings had led a military expedition across the Mediterranean Sea to Europe. This is the implication of the story that Herodotus, the father of history, recounts in his histories about an ancient Egyptian king named Sesostris, most likely a rendering of Senusret, and therefore a reference to Senusret I, or his namesakes, Senusret II and Senusret III. From the era itself, we get a good sense of how the society of the Middle Kingdom functioned from the Hekanacht papyri, a collection of papyrus letters found in the tomb of Ipi, a vizier understood to have served one of the 12th dynasty rulers, or possibly a late 11th dynasty king. The name of these papyri derives from having been written by a priest named Hekanacht, who was employed to look after the tombs at the necropolis where Ipi's remains were. They discuss a wide range of issues relating to land ownership, commerce, taxation, and so forth. Hekanacht was writing these to his family and the servants who managed his estate, so they shine a light on how an upper middle-class priest associated with the government was able to engage in administration of his lands from a distance. He did this by writing letters to his family and servants, even while he carried out his work far away, tending to the tombs of the deceased. All of this points towards a decent level of literacy and of functional estate administration and commercial knowledge amongst the upper middle class and their servants 4,000 years ago in Middle Kingdom Egypt. The height of the Middle Kingdom was attained in the first 2 centuries of the 2nd millennium BC, basically between around 2000 BC and 1800 BC. As ever, the dates are disputed by Egyptologists, as the king lists differ in their dating and chronology, but typically the 12th dynasty is deemed to have come to an end in or around 1803 BC. The 13th dynasty that followed is categorized as the final dynasty of the Middle Kingdom. However, this is disputed by other Egyptologists. The issue concerns the sheer length of the dynasty and its changing fortunes. There were dozens of rulers of this dynasty, several of whom only reigned for a few years or even a few months, and the dynasty as a whole ruled for a century and a half, down to around 1650 BC. The issue of whether it should be categorized as part of the Middle Kingdom centers on the changing fortunes of the dynasty. It is evident that at its beginning, and during the reigns of several of the more successful 13th dynasty kings, royal power extended over most of Egypt and strong rule was maintained. A number of the kings of the dynasty built pyramids at Dashur, notably the Pyramid of Khenjer, which included an impressive 150-ton solid quartzite block carved as a single pyramidion. Conversely, as the dynasty went on, and as weaker rulers achieved power for brief periods, royal governance was severely weakened, and disorder began to develop across much of Egypt. As we'll see very shortly, by the end of the 13th dynasty, Egypt had become immensely unstable, and eventually descended into a period of foreign invasion and rule, combined with regional strife. As such, historians and archaeologists alike have been unsure whether to categorize the 13th dynasty as part of the golden age that was the Middle Kingdom. It started out as such, to an extent, yet it didn't remain that way for long. Royal power broke down, the culture associated with the 12th dynasty declined, and the Middle Kingdom's golden days went into the rear-view mirror. Owing to these issues, there are some Egyptologists today who categorize the 13th dynasty as belonging to an era of wider ancient Egyptian history known as the Second Intermediate Period. This categorization was developed to distinguish the long stretch of disorder and instability which characterized the period between the end of the Middle Kingdom and the advent of the New Kingdom. a new golden age of Egypt that began around 1550 BC. As should be clear from the description of the debate over the 13th dynasty, this means that the second intermediate period can be identified in two ways. One of these is that it stretched from around 1800 BC, when the 13th dynasty came to power, to 1550 BC. An alternative is that it was much shorter, a truncated period of around a century between 1650 BC and 1550 BC. This is a point of academic debate. What mattered for the people on the ground in ancient Egypt in the 18th and 17th centuries BC is that they would have felt that their kingdom was in decline and that their lives were getting harder. The primary causes were relatively clear. Strong royal rule collapsed during the 13th dynasty, in part caused by the rapid turnover of rulers. Then, a foreign power decided to exploit Egypt's weakness. These are known as the Hyksos today, a name derived from an ancient Greek term which basically means rulers of foreign lands. The scholarly consensus is that they were actually a confederacy of Levantine people and other West Asians, including the Canaanites, who began making raids into Egypt and eventually occupied parts of the region. The Middle Kingdom was characterized by Baron Christian von Bunsen in the mid-19th century as one of the three golden ages of ancient Egyptian history, alongside the Old Kingdom and the New Kingdom. There is no doubting that of these three alleged golden ages, the Middle Kingdom was the least impressive. It did not have anything that could match the sheer spectacle of the pyramids at Giza, Dashur and Saqqara, that the rulers of the Old Kingdom built, and which still stand nearly 5 millennia later as a testament to the power of rulers such as Djoser, Sneferu, Khufu, and Khafre. Equally, the rulers of the 12th dynasty, at the height of the Middle Kingdom, did not build temples to match those erected by pharaohs like Ramesses II during the New Kingdom, nor did they build an empire as impressive as that of Thutmose III, Ramesses' New Kingdom forebear. Even so, the rulers of the Middle Kingdom, especially those of the 12th dynasty, did have their achievements. They built their own pyramids, for instance. While most of these partially collapsed before long in antiquity, owing to the cheaper and faster building methods employed to construct them, they were accomplished in different ways. The temple complexes and courtyards around these pyramids, for example, were often more elaborate than had been the case during the Old Kingdom. The pyramidions that have survived from the Middle Kingdom point to an ability to quarry huge blocks of granite and quartzite that were then carved and lifted into place as one impressive piece of polished stone. Perhaps more importantly, Senusret I is the king that was responsible for having the first monumental obelisks that we know of carved and hoisted into position. He and his near successors, such as Senusret III, were kings of ancient Egypt whose power was as substantial as many of the most powerful rulers of the Old and New Kingdoms. Furthermore, many papyrus manuscripts like the Instructions to Amenemhat point to a thriving culture where some people clearly enjoyed a high quality of life. Moreover, the mathematical and astronomical discoveries being made by priests and other scholars in Egypt and Babylon at this time were of a kind that impacted on ancient knowledge for centuries to come. Without their accomplishments, the thriving late Bronze Age culture that characterized the Eastern Mediterranean in the middle of the 2nd millennium BC, and of which the New Kingdom was part, might never have developed. Perhaps that is the greatest achievement of the Middle Kingdom. What do you think of the Middle Kingdom? Do the breakthroughs made in terms of government, mathematical knowledge, medicine, and astronomy mark it as a golden age of ancient Egypt? Or does it pale by comparison with the Old and New Kingdoms? Please Let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.